On today's Eastern Conference edition of Locked On NHL, we are beginning our season previews. We're going to start at the top with the President's Trophy winning New York Rangers and all the teams in the Metropolitan that qualified for last year's playoffs. That's all coming up on today's Locked On NHL. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On NHL, your team every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we have local experts on the biggest stories 5 days a week. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. You can also find every local expert wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on YouTube. My name's Ross Levitan. You can find me 5 days a week over at Locked On Ottawa Senators, and I have a very special guest. The Battle of Ontario, it's getting too bitter this time of year. You know, we're about to play each other in the preseason, so I told Mikey, take the week off. I don't want to see you. And instead, we've got the host of Locked On Edmonton Oilers, Nick Zararis, with us. What's going on, Nick? Thanks for doing this.
Nothing much. I'm excited. I'm getting the itch. I'm seeing informal skates. We were talking the NHL media stuff in Vegas. We're getting there.
We certainly are. Rookie tournaments this weekend all across North America, from Penticton down to the southeastern part of the States, and that's just the first step in the evaluations. We're going to make our evaluations, though, based on the players that are arriving next week. The big dogs, the NHLers, the guys who make fans really get into this sport. I think hockey's on a upwards trajectory, rightfully so. The obvious viewership numbers in the States being on ESPN and TNT. But Nick, this Metropolitan Division, for me, is a little more top-heavy. I look at the Atlantic Division, and there's always that arms race between the three teams that have always had their spots. Meanwhile, we go to the Metropolitan, and I think we got to start with the New York Rangers, President's Trophy winners. They get that 1 point cushion right at the end of the season, but they earned it over the Dallas Stars right down to the wire. What are your expectations for the Rangers? Is it cup or bust in the Big Apple?
It kind of has to be the way the roster's set up. This is the last year of Shesterkin being cheap. He's going to go to at least 12 million, more likely than not, next summer. And once you have him at 12, you got Panarin at 12, Trouba at 8, Zibanejad at 8, Fox at 9.5. Really quickly, you're looking at a Leaf-style situation, an Oilers-style situation, where you're going to have 4 or 5 guys making up almost half of your entire cap position. So as far as roster construction, yes. And as far as like window of opportunity, they're not getting any younger. Kreider, Zibanejad, Trocheck, all over the age of 30. You don't know what you have in Trouba, whether or not he'll be able to bounce back. And you don't want to say they gave you your best shot last year, but it kind of feels like that was their best shot at it. It takes a lot to go right to win a President's Trophy, to get to a Game 6 of a conference finals against a really good Florida team. So I don't necessarily think they're out of luck if it doesn't work out this year, but I do think it's going to taking a step back after this season if they can't finally break through to eventually be able to.
Unless, and Chris Drury probably banking on this, you get another massive leap forward from Alexis Lafreniere, who found his way through the second half of that season, putting up offensive numbers that you would have expected him to put up in previous years, but 28 goals, like, is it out of the question for him to hit 40 this year? I don't think so. I think he's got that kind of upside and that kind of skill, and he should get the opportunity as well. Now, with Lafreniere, I think it's more likely than with Capo Caco, who has found his way into what feels like the doghouse at times. Still had 13 goals, but for a second overall pick in 2019, you'd like that to be a little bit more efficient and effective in the lineup. So you don't believe, maybe as much as I do, that second level of offensive talent can produce and maybe make up for a little bit of regression that you could see from other guys at the top of their lineup?
That's kind of the math problem you're trying to work out. Last year, Panarin had, I want to say it was 100 more shots than he had ever had in a season before. It's why he was 1 goal short of 50 last year. I do think there's a good chance you see some of those goals go the other way, where Trocheck and Lafreniere will chip in a few more than Panarin will. But for Lafreniere, the counting stats probably aren't going to be there to the degree everybody kind of expects because he's not forcing anyone off of that first power play. They're not going to take Kreider off at the net front. Trocheck has been really good in the 2 years he's been there at the middle. Panarin's not coming off. Fox isn't coming off, and Zibanejad's not coming off. It's not necessarily that he can't do it. It's that he doesn't have the ice time. You know, when you don't get those man advantage minutes, especially on a power play as good as the Rangers, the counting stats won't ever be there. As far as secondary scoring, Kakko missed a lot of time last year. If he can stay healthy, that number probably creeps up closer 15, 20. Riley Smith is interesting in the idea he's cheap. He's a rebound candidate. He's going to ride shotgun, at least to start, with Zibanejad and Kreider. So the potential for some positive regression there, because if you're just doing a lateral move of Blake Wheeler for Riley Smith, you do that every day of the week. It's just a matter of how much more can you realistically get out of him.
Another big question for me with the New York Rangers, and maybe you have more insight than I do on this, but Philip Hedl, is he expected to be there at camp?
From what I understand, yes. They were very, very cautious about playing him. He wasn't in hockey shape, you know, as much as you can say he worked out, he was skating, whatever. That's very different from playing in the playoffs against the Hurricanes, playing against the Panthers. So he didn't look comfortable yet. It wasn't that he was reluctant to get hit or anything. His conditioning just wasn't there. Playing in a game, you imagine a whole summer, he will come into the preseason, and they are banking on him being that 3C to give them that deeper look in their lineup that they needed at times, and they didn't really have for a lot of the regular season last year. You got till about the trade deadline last year with the Rangers basically having 1.5 functional lines at 5-on-5, and Wenberg and Roslovic ultimately didn't really work out for them. But as far as the underlying numbers, possession, they weren't bad. It's just they didn't score enough, and a lot of people need that third line to be contributing on offense, and that was ultimately their undoing. Florida was able to get depth goals from guys like Luosterainen and Kevin Stenlund in the conference final, as opposed to the Rangers, who Gaudreau, Lafreniere, Trocheck, you know, Zibanejad had 1 goal, but other than him, it was just those 3 guys who scored all of them.
For the New York Rangers, their offseason consisted of bringing in Riley Smith, Sam Carrick up front. Zach Jones going to get an opportunity on the back end. He was an exciting prospect for them, and it looks like he'll finally get a chance at an everyday role. I had as a breakout candidate, Nick, when we did it a couple weeks ago, Braden Schneider. I've got huge hopes for him. I don't know if the offense is ever going to be there, but I find these physically dominant junior defensemen, it takes them a couple of years of figuring out when they can step up and be that imposing figure. I think he's got a bit of Trouba in his game, honestly, and I'd like to see him maybe keep it a bit cleaner and stay out of the Department of Player Safety, but throw his weight around and kind of ease the pressure on an Adam Fox to do anything more than what he does magic in the offensive zone. A lot of these teams, I'm going to ask you, if they make the playoffs, what has to go right? I think things would have to go completely off the rails for the Rangers to go out of the playoffs. So let's get to what would be a disappointing season for you, for the New York Rangers.
First round exit. You got to win at least 1 playoff series. Once you get past the first round, then it starts becoming about matchups, how healthy you are, that type of thing. But the expectation for the Rangers is at least 1 series win. I mean, Gallant got them to a conference finals, and then the year after, they lost in the first round to a pretty good Devils team, and that wasn't good enough. So I would expect the standard to be the same here.
2 conference finals appearances in the last 3 years for the New York Rangers, the reigning President's Trophy champions. We're also going to get to the other New York team, but Carolina finished right behind the New York Rangers. Their season preview is next. You're listening to the Eastern Conference edition of Locked On NHL, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. When you need tickets, you need Gametime. I just bought a dozen tickets for the Ottawa Senators home opener, and there was nowhere I was going to get them outside of Gametime, because Gametime's got that toggle option. When I put all-in pricing, they mean it. No surprise at checkout. That is the worst. I'll get to the promo code. We can take even more dollars and cents off of Gametime, where you can also get tickets not only for sports, comedy, theater, music, whenever you're going to an event. If you want the best prices, make sure you get them at Gametime. Gametime has Gametime picks. They cut out the fluff. They filter what you need in a great night out. You can also see your view from the seats. You don't want to get to the game and there's a big pole in your way. No way. Not at Gametime. Gametime's got it all figured out for you at Gametime. So because you're a listener of Locked On NHL, you are entitled to $20 off your first purchase. Just download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL at checkout. That's Gametime app. Create an account and use code LOCKEDONNHL. That's LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Welcome back, Locked On NHL, your team every day. You can find us 5 days a week wherever you get podcasts. We are free and available on YouTube. You can also find all of our great local hosts there, like Locked On Edmonton Oilers. I'm joined by Nick Zararis. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me over at Locked On Ottawa Senators. We're continuing our Eastern Conference previews, which are only bound to go horribly wrong. Like my prediction each and every year, Nick, when I say this the year the Boston Bruins are going to take a step back. I've learned my lesson solely from the Boston Bruins that I suck at predictions. So I would like to have it out there. None of this is gambling advice. None of this is any advice that can help you make money.
Oh, of course not. Nobody knows anything. That's why they play the games.
But it's awesome, man. I'm so excited for the season to finally get here. And every year, the sexy pick to win the cup. It's the Carolina Hurricanes. They haven't gotten to a final since they lifted that trophy with a young Cam Ward in 2006, but they've got awfully close. Is this the year for the Carolina Hurricanes, Nick?
Probably not, no, in all honesty. They've lost a lot of guys over the last 2 seasons. You go look at their lineup, and really quickly you start squinting and you're, who is this? When did they sign this person? They've lost a lot of talent over the last few years, and that's what happens when you're a good team. You are supposed to be dinged by the salary cap. You lose talent, you lose depth, and they are still a solid team, but it doesn't have the same oomph to it that it looked like they were going to have. The Gensel sliding doors is very interesting for them, where they thought they were going to have him long term, and then very quickly it got weird and he's in Tampa Bay now, and they ended up re-upping with Marty Necas, and kind of everybody put their arms down and said, okay, you still got Jarvis, you've got Svechnikov, you got Aho, you got Slavin. It's a solid group, but it doesn't have the same depth as it's had the last few seasons.
I think that's very well said. They're looking for another big step forward from their recently signed right winger, Seth Jarvis, and I think he does have another gear in him, but you're obviously going to miss that upfront scoring talent. Now, what I find funny, Nick, and we're going to get to a potential breakout candidate in Bradley Nadeau, for me, a guy who was a quick riser through the draft process, but every day after the draft, every public scout tells you that the Carolina Hurricanes won the draft. So I'm just thinking that if they're going to move on from half of their top 4 on the back end, losing out on Brady Shea and losing out on Brett Pesce, that you think, I know they've got this Nikishin guy in Russia who's just kind of biding his time, one more year as captain there before he comes over, but I don't know if we're going to see another surprise player, maybe a Jackson Blake who signed out of North Dakota, but I think they're kind of zeroing in on Bradley Nadeau as a guy who might have to play a top 6 role. Or do you see this as next man up, where these third liners can maybe just gain some experience and get more opportunity and produce more?
It's interesting because Carolina has really fostered we use all 4 lines interchangeably. We use all our pairs interchangeably. And the idea being that when the time comes that we start losing our high-end guys, we're not going to have a terribly big drop-off from line to line, because we've always been more of a greater than the sum of our parts team. You know, when you line them up with the Rangers, with the Panthers, with the Lightning, with the Bruins, their high-end guys are all a tier below those elite of the elite guys. But Carolina's proposition has always been, we're going to litter our lineup with energy, with intensity. We're going to forecheck. We're going to cycle. We're going to outwork you. We may not be the most talented team, and I do think that bodes reasonably well for that next man up mentality, like you just said, because this is how it's been, you know, integrating Jack Drury in over the last season and a half, 2 years, to get him to the point where he's going to be able to contribute in a top 6 role. Same thing with Seth Jarvis, who really hit the ground running last year and really looks like he has the goods. The big question I have for them is the back end, because it's older. It's not as defense oriented as the Hurricanes have been over the last handful of seasons. It's a okay, talent wise group, but it feels like they definitely almost certainly missed their window. That's the thing that I keep coming back to with Carolina in particular, because their entire proposition was, we have all these really talented guys on restricted free agent deals, and now they're starting to have to pay those guys out. They don't have the flexibility to keep adding and building out, and they lost guys. Shea and Pesce, one of the best defensive pairs in the entire league last year, and you just lose that outright. It's going to be an adjustment year for Carolina.
Carolina's made the playoffs in 6 straight seasons. They made it to the conference finals 2 summers ago, spring, I should say. Were swept by the Florida Panthers in that series, but don't tell Rod Brindamore that. Second round exits in the 3 of the other 4 years, including last season where they fell to the New York Rangers. That, though, was after beating the New York Islanders, who went from bubble team to question mark. They didn't have great goaltending from Ilya Sorokin, but were able to still find a way into the playoffs. Their season previews next. We're also going to cover the Washington Capitals. Before we get to both of those teams, though, Nick, what's a disappointing season for the Hurricanes? Is it that pesky second round that they've had so much trouble in once again?
I think when you're a team like Carolina, you're trying to get as many cracks at the playoffs as you possibly can. You think about the teams that have finally broken through after being there consistently, like the Blues, like the Capitals, like the Lightning for a lot of last decade. You just keep throwing playoff attempts at the wall, and eventually you're going to break through, or everyone gets fired. I don't think anyone's getting fired if Carolina doesn't get to like a conference final, but I do think at some point you need an honest account of why we can't do this. And in my opinion, it's been the lack of high-end talent. Aho is great. Svechnikov is really good. Brent Burns is still pretty good. Those guys are all a tier below the best players in the world, and that's repeatedly why they've come up short, especially against the Rangers. When you look at the 2 second-round series this past season and the one 2.5, 3 years ago now, the Rangers' best players outplayed Carolina's best players, and that was the difference in the series.
For more on the Carolina Hurricanes, you can go check out Locked On Hurricanes with Zach Martin. He's got you all covered for all things Carolina. On the other side, we got the New York Islanders and Washington Capitals still to come. You're listening to Locked On NHL, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed's your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visits, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates and fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Indeed is leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day. Their matching system constantly learns from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent and fast. And our listeners get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/locked-on. Just go to Indeed.com/locked-on right now and show our support by saying you heard about Indeed on Locked On NHL. Indeed.com/locked-on. Terms and conditions apply. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Welcome back to another edition of Locked On NHL, your team every day. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network, where you will find local experts on the biggest stories 5 days a week. You can find me at Locked On Ottawa Senators. I'm Ross Levitan. That is Nick Zararis from Locked On Edmonton Oilers. Now, the New York Islanders, those overtime loss merchants from last season, are they for real or are they frauds? Because the numbers under Patrick Waugh, when he took over, they started to look a little bit more sustainable going forward. Where do you stand on the Islanders, Nick?
That's kind of one of the eternal questions. Year over year, you don't really know what you're going to get. 2 years ago, Sorokin was put together one of the best goalie seasons we've ever seen. And this past year, he was below league average. Patrick Waugh rode Varlamov down the stretch, giving him a lot of back-to-backs, started him in the playoffs. The Islanders are a two-line team. That's been their issue for the last few years. They have really solid players. You know, Brock Nelson, extremely underrated, can flirt with 40 goals. Horvat and Barzal have put together a really nice tandem. Even Kyle Palmieri at this stage of his career has been pretty effective. I really like the Duclair fit for them. They've needed a little bit more speed, especially in their top six. It's kind of, for the Islanders, I think it almost matters as much what the teams around them do as far as performance, as much as they do. Because, like you said, they came out of the gate really slow last year. They didn't relieve Lane Lambert of his job until I want to say December, January. And Waugh got in there relatively late. The numbers were promising, but this group, it lacks the juice, the high end talent. It's a solid team. I think if things break right for them, they're definitely a playoff team. But as we've seen 2 years in a row when they've made the playoffs, they don't have the goods to hang with Carolina. I struggle to imagine them faring particularly well against the Rangers, against the Devils, or any of the top three in the Atlantic if they were a wild card this year.
It's a long time since those back-to-back runs to the conference finals in the COVID bubble, and then the year afterwards where they lost in the semifinals. But I just think Patrick Waugh, man, he's the kind of guy you need to give him a training camp where he really kind of implements the structure. And I know it's junior, it's completely different, and teams that have more money will typically perform better. But the job he did with the Quebec Empire the last couple of years he was there was like, he's a guy where when talking Ottawa was about DJ Smith getting let go, like I was all in on Patty Waugh being the guy. So just because he goes to New York, I can't flip on that. I think he's a really good coach. And it's that second job bump where a coach goes in, learns a lot, but doesn't have success their first role. I think going in mid-season is kind of a good way to get the lay of the land. Still, I think kind of met, but didn't go crazy versus expectations. Got them into the playoffs, though. And then now he can really establish that. I love that you brought up Anthony Duclair. Huge fan of the speed aspect that he'll bring to that lineup. And they've got this sneaky Russian kid who lit it up with Moscow, Tsiplikov, if I'm pronouncing that right. And every year, somewhere, Nick, you see this guy, 23 to 25-year-old Russian that comes over and puts up 30 to 50 points. And you're like, oh, wow, I had no idea who that was. They were just developing out of sight, out of mind. So he's kind of slated to be potentially another dynamic player, which is something that the Islanders historically have gone away from. They love that prototypical second, third line talent who can really work hard and get things done. But I like what the Islanders have done. So I'll go on and say that they're, to me, 70 to 80% playoff team going into the season. I really like what the Islanders have done. For you, as well as it playoffs for the Islanders, that should be the expectation for the group after back-to-back first-round exits.
I think they're probably one of the safer teams in that bubble. You know, if you talk about Washington, Pittsburgh, the Flyers, Ottawa, Buffalo, the Islanders, of that group, I feel like the Islanders probably have the highest floor because we've seen them do it a few years in a row. Whereas the other teams I just mentioned, they need a little bit more to go their way because they haven't been there consistently the last few years. I think they're fine, and it really comes down to how everybody else around them performs.
It's going to be awesome to see. And we can't talk about the Islanders without Noah Dobson, like one of my favorite defensemen to watch. He should be up there with like the Charlie McAvoys, the Adam Foxes, and Quinn Hughes. Maybe not that upper, but he is so talented. He was at a point per game last year, 6'3", right shot moves so smooth out there. And look for Alexander Romanov to take another step forward. He's going to get that first chance to play with Dobson on the top pair. He had a sneaky, decent offensive season last year as well. I'm just pulling up the number on it, but maybe not. He was plus 23, though. Maybe that's the number that jumped out, but maybe there's a little bit more to unlock in his game after they gave up quite a bit. I think the 13th overall pick to get him in that three-way trade where Kirby Dach ends up in Montreal. All right. I think we can get to the Washington Capitals. And Nick, I almost feel like we saved the best for last, at least in terms of what they did when they took absolute Barry Bonds level cuts at the plate, bringing in two malaligned players, I'll call it, maybe misunderstood players, but Jacob Chychrun and Pierre-Luc Dubois, two of the most polarizing players in the league, for my money. How do you think that they're going to fit with this core that's like aging, but then like McMichael and Miroshnichenko, they feel like they do almost have with Hendrix Lapierre as well, this like little bit of a second push with younger players coming up. But it was just such like a, hey, we're going to tell Ovi, like, we're going to go for it. We're going to bring you some players who are in their prime.
It's at this point, what do you have to lose if you're Washington? You've won your cup. You're trying to get Ovi the goal scoring record. If the team is bad and you don't have Pierre-Luc Dubois and Jacob Chychrun, the team is bad. If you have both of them and the team is bad anyway, okay, whatever. It doesn't matter. they're playing with house money at this point. It really doesn't matter. They'll retire Ovechkin and Backstrom's numbers. Ovechkin's going to break the goal scoring record. He'll play until he breaks it. And then, I like McMichael. I like LaPierre. They've got an interesting second wave of guys. They've got the Protoss brother, Dylan Strome, put together 2 good seasons in a row there. They have enough guys that they should be competitive most nights. And I don't think they're a playoff team unless they get really good goaltending again, because frankly, if it weren't for Charlie Lindgren, they would have been in the lottery last year. So they're hinging a lot on their goaltending to be a good team this year, but they took really big swings, and that's all I want. If I were a fan of the Capitals, I would be happy, because I would rather my general manager try and it not work out than playing it safe and doing what the Flyers did all those years under Chuck Fletcher, where we're going to stay the course. We have a plan. That's great. But if you don't eventually start using your assets to turn them into something, you don't really have a plan.
41 goals for Alex Ovechkin to tie Wayne Gretzky. Does he do it this season?
He would need a crazy, I think the only way that happens if he has like an Erik Karlsson, like -40 plus minus, where it's only about offense for him, which it very well could. He got to 30 somehow last year. He was at, I want to say, like 10 at the All-Star break. And
his splits were outrageous.
He turned it on in that second half, and that really got him close. I think there's a good chance he gets into the mid-30s this year. If everything breaks right for him, he could definitely do it this year. 40 goals for Ovechkin is very doable, even at his age.
15 goals in the final 24 games of the season for Alexander Ovechkin. Now going into season number 20 in the National Hockey League. Truly amazing that we've gotten to see this generation of Alex Ovechkin and Sidney Crosby at the top of their game. So much fun to watch. And I'm sure he's happy to have a little bit more offensive-minded talent around him. Here's a super random aside as a goalie-friendly show over at Locked On Sens. This has to be the first time where a team has both goalies that catch, I call it backwards, but catch with their right hand. Charlie Lindgren, and they bring in over Logan Thompson from Vegas. Do you think Logan Thompson has another step to his game that we didn't get to see, where Adin Hill kind of jumped him on that Stanley Cup run?
I think that's a good tandem. I don't think either of those guys is a bell cow 55, 60 start guy, but if they're both 40-ish, I think you could get a lot more out of them by giving them a lighter workload. That's traditionally what we've seen in these tandem goalies, is that if you give them the right workload, the right sweet spot, you can get a lot more out of them than if you rode one into the ground.
I want them to do well. I really do, but I know that the Devils, with the moves they made this offseason, they're going to, unless there's all 5 from the Metro, which I highly doubt, one of these teams has to go. And I just waxed poetically about Patrick Waugh. So I'm going to have to say the Capitals for me are out, and the Devils are going to jump into that spot.
That's a reasonable guess. In football, it's a little more. It's usually 3 of the playoff teams vary out. But in hockey, especially in the East, it's only been 1 or 2 the last handful of seasons. So if you ask me right now, I would probably say Washington. A sneaky one, it's not even really sneaky. The other team is probably the Islanders, but Carolina and the Rangers almost assuredly are in.
Yeah, the only thing to me, and they even have a backup plan, I was going to say, because Freddie Anderson isn't getting any younger. He's had a few injuries over time, but feels like Pyotr Kochetkov, they're happy to have him kind of keep earning more starts and getting more playing time. So the Metropolitan, a little top heavy with the Rangers and Canes, and we'll see how everything shakes out there. Nick, final thoughts? Appreciate you joining us. That was a lot of fun today. Start our season previews. We mentioned it. The scent of hockey is really in the air now after Labor Day weekend. What's coming up on Locked On Oilers? I'm sure it's cup or bust there, but what can you tell people is coming up on the show?
So on Wednesday, I did a perspective best guess at what the opening night lineup is going to look like based on how the informal skates have gone so far, who could force their way into the lineup, that type of thing. Tomorrow, going to take a look at Dermott, because they're supposedly going to bring in Travis Dermott on a PTO. So a whole 30 minutes on a 7th defenseman, which is exactly what we need.
We just did recently our immediate reaction of Nick Cousins signing a 1-year, $800,000 deal. It's our 7th most viewed video on YouTube in our show's history. So people are starving for hockey. It's that time of year. And with training camp rolling, rookie camp already underway, hockey season is here. So make sure you're locked on to your favorite NHL team and your least favorite. Go have some fun in the comments as well. It's all what it comes down to is just good banter, rivalry, and the passion that the Locked On hosts bring each and every market. So you can make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. NFL season's underway. Locked On is your team every day. We mean it when we say it. Every sport, type in the team Locked On blank, and you'll get a latest 30-minute expert from a passionate fan who is locked on to your team. For today, we say goodbye. We'll hand it over to Power Rankings Thursdays on Locked On NHL. For Nick Zararis, I'm Ross Levitan. Thank you for watching, listening to another edition of Locked On NHL. It's your team every day.